here's your sentence. Taped here. Oh, they've taped a short one here. And then you have the slide behind you. Okay. You're getting a good crowd, Evie. So you're all set. Okay. It would have come from me. But I'll get it for you. I'll get it off my email. It's kind of slow.
I know I put them all of them together in one file, but I can't find the file. I know I did make it.
Okay, I'm going to email it to you. Well, why don't you just, can you type in your own email?
There's an S after the T.
Okay, I just sent it. Or I could just pull it up here and leave you with my phone. You want me to do that? Okay. Well, I could pull it up on my phone and leave my phone here. If you're worried about time, it's right here.
I don't want to deprive you of your phone.
Why don't you take a picture of it right now with your phone?
I will lose the stuff that I have ready to use. I can't afford the distraction. Send it to me.
I did.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the plenary on gender and intersectional violence. I would like to start. My name is Evi TASTSOGLOU, and I teach at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Canada. I would like to start by the acknowledgement, the land acknowledgement. As noted in more detail in the opening ceremony, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the indigenous peoples of this region. We are fortunate here today to have four great scholars from different continents and different parts of the world. We will be following the order in which they are listed in the program. We will be starting with Patricia Hill Collins. Before I will be introducing each one of them. Then they have about 15 minutes of a presentation, and hopefully that will leave us with about 10 minutes in the end for discussion. I'm sorry that the time is so condensed. I would like to give them the opportunity to speak as much as possible, given the time constraints. Before we start, I would also like to acknowledge the significance of the topic of gender and intersectional violence. This is very much part of the agenda prior and ongoing of the current ISA president, Dr. Margaret Abraham, and together with the topic of the theme of the conference on power and violence and responsibility, are the very important dimensions of her own research and the research path that she has carved for the International Sociological Association. So, Patricia Hill Collins is Distinguished University Professor, Emerita of Sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park, and Charles Phelps Taft Professor Emerita of Sociology within the Department of African American Studies at the University of Cincinnati. Her award-winning books include Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment, which received both the Jessie Bernard Award of the American Sociological Association and the C. Wright Mills Award of the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and Black Sexual Politics, African Americans, Gender, and the New Racism, which received the ASA's 2007 Distinguished Publication Award. She is also author of many well-known books, as well as forthcoming ones. Professor Collins has taught at several institutions, held editorial positions with professional journals, lectured widely in the United States and internationally, and acted as consultant for a number of community organizations. In 2008, she became ASA's 100th president, the first African-American woman elected to this position in the organization's 104-year history, and in 2017 was the recipient of the ASA's William Du Bois Career of Distinguished Scholarship Award. Join me, please, in welcoming Patricia Hill Collins.
Be patient.
Panel, or did you just run up here to save us?
Ah, yes, okay. That looks like me. Thank you very much. Our time is short, so I'm going to be presenting to you highlights from a much longer paper, but I'll also be talking with you about the work that I've been doing over time and also things that I'm thinking about right now. I'm looking at the connection between violence and intersecting power relations. I'm particularly interested in exploring that particular relationship. So that will be my presentation today. So today I'll talk with you about three main things. They are, first of all, violence as a catalyst for intersectional analysis. I'm going to argue that intersectionality as we know it today and as it is named today is very much the result of activists and intellectuals who've been very involved in anti-violence activities. The catalyst for their involvement in social justice has been violence. And as they've moved along with that particular set of ideas, intersectionality presented itself as an analysis that was needed. So violence is not just gender, not just race, not just class, not just sexuality. The particular problem that you're dealing with compels someone toward an intersectional analysis if it's involved with social justice analysis. The second theme I'll be discussing and exploring is the notion of where we are now, using intersectionality to conceptualize violence. I think we're at a very interesting point where a lot of wonderful work has been done on violence, drawing upon the ideas of intersectionality. But we are at a moment where we can turn the lens around and say, how does that work inform broader questions of how we might understand violence itself? Are we thinking about violence too narrowly, too smallly, just in connection with our own project, our own point of view, our own nation, our own region, our own family, our own internal state, as it were? So I want to think about how we can do more synthetic work that draws upon intersectionality to reconceptualize and to redefine violence. And then I'll say a few words about the reverse relationship, using this focus on violence to theorize intersectionality. And here I'll be discussing very briefly a main idea of intersectionality, which is that power relations are intersecting. Many people who do violence work, violence scholarship or violence activism, draw upon the idea, this particular idea, that there is a mutual construction among race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, nation, and age, for example. But what is the nature of that particular relationship? In many ways, that's an unformed thesis that we haven't really fully fleshed out. So I want to ask the question, how this particular work on violence might in fact inform that particular question. Now, you all look like a very, very erudite group. Are you erudite? Yeah, I think so. So I'm going to be much more abstract and quick than normal because I want to stay within my 15 minutes. All right, let's see how far we get. So first of all, violence as a catalyst for intersectional analysis. I'm going to argue, as I've just mentioned, that violence has really been central as a catalyst for social justice activism and analysis. And in particular, gender analysis or gender violence has been a catalyst for both projects, for both social justice in general and for intersectionality. For that reason, you see women as very prominently represented in intersectional analysis, but that doesn't mean that intersectional analysis can be conflated with gender or gender violence. They are interconnected, but they are not the same thing. But I want to point out that gender violence has often been the catalyst that has led us to the space of intersectionality. So in other words, intersectionality as a social justice project, which I'd like to emphasize. Not intersectionality just as something we study, something that we study for any topic, but the kind of intersectionality that has been associated with its history and its practitioners has been interconnected with some ways to understand and address violence. This I'm going to put up and just talk very briefly. I do not want to go into the details, but what I would argue is that the case of U.S. black feminism, which is what I specialize in and where that's my angle of vision, has been central to both thinking about intersectionality, thinking about violence, and thinking about social justice. That very much the kind of intersectionality one gets when one looks at African American women propels one in that particular direction. And it's a much more robust analysis. It certainly takes on gender. It is gendered in some very profound ways, but it's also been more than gender. And gender has also tried to inform the social justice struggles of African Americans. That's where African American women have been central. I bring to your attention 4 examples over time that I would argue form a trajectory that are connected, each of which deals with anti-violence and violence in a particular way. There's an expression that says the more things change, the more they stay the same. So in many ways, we see changes, but they're the same, the changing same of inequality, and violence has been central to that. The first person who's up here, or the first set of ideas that are up here, are those of Ida Wells Barnett and anti-lynching. If you're familiar with Ida Wells Barnett, she was a prominent turn-of-the-century, late 1900s, early 20th century. I never get that right for some reason. Just why do they do that to us? Why don't they match the actual numbers to make it easier? All right. Thank you. Perfect. All right. So Ida Wells Barnett was very concerned about the lynching of African Americans, particularly African American men. And she put forth a very provocative campaign that linked racism, nationalism in terms of state-sanctioned violence, and sexism. And she also argued quite provocatively about sexuality and interracial sexuality as a factor in all of these things in terms of this particular state-sanctioned violence. And that was beginning in the 1910s. Now, very often we don't think of Ida Wells Barnett as a black feminist because her focus was on men, and yet her work was very much about gendered state violence and laid a foundation for our understandings of gendered violence. Angela Y. Davis, who many of you are familiar with, put forth a very interesting and provocative analysis of gendered violence around rape. Her work on capitalism, slavery, and sexual violence from the 1970s to now shows this dual prong between the type of gendered violence that black women experience of rape and the prison system as a particular form of state-sanctioned violence, primarily against African American men. Now, those are not mutually exclusive, but the point that I would like to make is that Angela Davis did not add capitalism back into gender. She was presenting an intersectional analysis without it being called as such in the 1970s. Kimberly Crenshaw in the early 1990s was interested in violence against women of color. And this is where we get the name intersectionality after this groundwork has been laid. She felt that there was no term that was capable of dealing with the type of gendered violence or the type of violence that that black women had been identifying. So she thought about this and introduced this term intersectionality, which there one sees the introduction of immigrant women as being crucial, which is the frame of nationalism, and the term women of color. Black Lives Matter movement, I think, has been a recent manifestation of this very long trajectory around violence and African American women, social justice, and intersectionality. The Black Lives Matter movement, many of us are familiar with, and you see also within that movement not just attention to police violence and saying things like Black Lives Matter, which is fundamentally what Ida Wells Barnett, Angela Y. Davis, Kimberly Crenshaw all have said before, along with many, many others, but you also see the introduction and deepening of an intersectional framework that is very much focused on heteropatriarchy and transgender issues as part of this trajectory, of a particular broadening, yet again, of this connection between intersectionality, social justice, and gender violence. So, wow, I didn't know I could get all that done. There we go. That was like 500 years of history in 3 minutes. All right. So this is part one. I'm wrapping up part one. So the challenge here is how do we sustain and advance intersectionality's commitment to addressing violence as an important social problem? This is the moment where the pressures that be want to co-opt, change, or in other words, alter what we're doing with this kind of work, this social justice work, this particular version of intersectionality. And by the way, even though I use the example of African American women, I think that there are multiple local stories and trajectories that do the same thing. Whether they are actually named as intersectionality or not is less interesting to me than looking at those particular connections. So this is the challenge. And by the way, there are two more. I was supposed to say that to you, a challenge for each part. So this is the first challenge. How do we sustain and advance intersectionality's commitment to addressing violence as an important social problem? When we neutralize intersectionality so it is not about violence, it becomes something else. When it is not about social justice, it can become about something else. And the question is what that something else might be. Using intersectionality to conceptualize violence. A rich body of scholarship uses intersectionality to analyze violence. Many of our panelists, I believe my panelists today, bring that to us. We have now a much greater richness of historical, regional, and contextualized understandings of gendered violence. So that's the body of literature that is out there. But my question is, where do we go from here with this literature? Is it, and practices, by the way, because activists make important contributions to this particular discussion. But where do we go from here with this? Is it enough to adhere to the Academy's version of just adding more and more and more knowledge, and therefore somehow truth will produce change? Or do we think about violence differently? Can we take a step back and say, how would we think about violence differently than the way we currently think about it, now that we know these things? We've been drawing upon intersectionality. So the question, where do we go from here, is that question, and how do we get there from here, is the political question, the strategic question. How do we take this wonderful, rich, heterogeneous body of work that's been catalyzed about violence and think about what to do with it to look back at the broader question of violence? In my own work, 20 years ago, and it stuns me to think that I'm standing here saying this. This was back in the day when I was walking and talking and all of that. You know, I just wasn't climbing up to the podium like this, all right? I wrote a piece called The Tie That Binds, and I was thinking about violence as the tie that bound together race, class, gender, and nation in the U.S., all right? So that's the approach that I took. And I put forth an argument that there were three ideas that where we might start, a starting place. Now, recently, in ethnic and racial studies, they have considered that, among many, a classic article. It's really kind of interesting to be a classic, as in old, classic Coke, classic car, whatever, you know, wherever you want to take classic, all right? But a classic article, and they asked us to revisit what we've written and comment on it. So that I did, and you can find what I said there. But just to foreshadow, the synergy of speech and action is something that I thought we might think about in reconceptualizing violence. And there I was looking at hate speech and acts of violence, because at the time we weren't thinking about speech and action as informing one another, right? Violence as routine and normal. A lot of people see routine violence and normal violence as, well, I mean, why would we even talk about it? It's so routinized. So the notion of identifying the institutional culpability for violence, and third, legitimating violence. Who controls the power to define what counts as violence? And this would be a much more aggressive discourse analysis that really looks at how those ideas are constructed, how ideas matter in producing that outcome. So that's the provisional framework that I would start off to, but that's not where we would stay. Hang in there. Debbie, don't worry. So challenge number 2. How do we develop more expansive definitions of violence that incorporate intersectional analyses? That's really the question, the next question. I think we're going to accumulate a lot of insight about violence in different places. I think we're going to accumulate a lot of insight of work that draws upon intersectionality, but the notion of what do we do with it. And I'm encouraging us to think about more expansive definitions of violence that perhaps either use the framework that I started with or produce a new one. I'm open to that, but I think that's the next task. So let me finish and move on to my third and final point. Using violence to theorize intersectionality. I'm working on a project now titled Not Just Ideas, Intersectionality, Critical Theory, and Social Change. It should be out next year. If it's not out next year, it is not the fault of the press, it would be my own fault. But what I'm thinking about is intersectionality as critical social theory. I see intersectionality itself as people saying it's a theory, but not necessarily knowing what that means. I'm trying to think through what that really might mean if we carved off that theoretical piece of this broader project. And my question is, there's a core theoretical premise in intersectionality, which is this: intersecting systems of power relations mutually construct one another. That's the premise everybody seems to draw upon. But what does that actually mean? I'm going to argue, or I would argue, that violence is what I would call a saturated site of intersecting power relations. This is the beginning of making the argument. What you find if you work on racism, if you work on sexism, heteropatriarchy, if you work on capitalism, nationalism, ableism, ageism, is that you find violence is central to all of those systems in some way. But what you also find is that violence is differently organized and configured across those different systems. So in that sense, to me, violence provides a window. Studying violence, examining violence, starting with violence, constitutes a window or a saturated site of intersecting power relations where all of these systems need violence in some way. But how is violence configured at that site? And of course, the implication is how is resistance and anti-violence also configured at that site? And that, to me, is the theoretical place for intersectionality. So to finish up with my third challenge, how might violence shed light on the ways in which intersecting systems of power mutually construct one another? That's a question that I'm interested in broadly. How do intersecting systems of power mutually construct one another? But the question that violence brings, because it's been so closely tied to the field and has served as a catalyst, and we've come so far in understanding it and revealing it, is how might this work that we're doing on violence actually shed light theoretically on the ways in which intersecting systems of power mutually construct one another? I thank you for being patient. How did I do? Is it 15 minutes? All right.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Moving next to Dr. Sonia Frías, the second presenter. Sonia was born in Barcelona, Spain, and she holds a PhD in sociology by the University of Texas at Austin. Since 2008, she is a researcher at the Regional Center for Multidisciplinary Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Her main areas of interest are violence against women, violence against children and adolescents, and victims' access to justice. During 2017-2018, she was principal investigator of a federally funded research project named Violence Against Indigenous Women and Girls. Please join me in welcoming Sonia Frías.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Evangelia and Rosemary for organizing and chairing this panel, and all of you for being here. The title of this panel is Gender Intersectional Violence, and I will discuss how intersectionality has been used or not to study gender-based violence against women by focusing in two specific stratification categories among Mexican females: age and ethnicity. I will also provide some empirical data about the specific forms of violence at which girls and adolescents, they are at a higher risk. And finally, I will discuss some methodological challenges to study different expressions of violence against women in a multicultural and multi-ethnic country such Mexico, in which very often the category woman is essentialized. During the 90s, the phenomenon of violence against women became a worldwide problem, mostly due to the efforts of the women's movements and feminist movements. Altogether, with the claims regarding sexual and reproductive rights, sexual and domestic violence gained visibility. Mexico was not an exception, and fueled by international pressure, first public policies were designed and implemented. Since 1997, in which the first family violence law was enacted, our conceptualization of violence against women has broadened, from family, partner, and sexual violence to include other relationship contexts and expressions, such as femicide, such as sexual harassment at work and in educational systems, institutional violence. Current data about violence against Mexican women offers a distressing scene, but very little is known about girls because most surveys, they tend to be centered on women 15 years old and over. But what we know, based on the last national survey on household dynamics that it was conducted in 2016, we know that 33% of the women experience obstetric violence at their last childbirth that occurred during the last 5 years. 8% experience physical violence, physical partner violence. Almost 4 out of 10 experienced during the last year some form of sexual violence and street harassment. 27% experienced workplace sexual harassment. And also, in the case of feminicides, Mexico has unfortunately captured international attention after the killings of women in Ciudad Juárez, and what we thought that it was something that was happening in Ciudad Juárez, we all know that this expression of violence against women is scattered around the country. It's estimated that 7 women are killed daily. My question is, where are indigenous women and girls in all these figures and official data? Where are indigenous women and girls in the newspapers? Mexico, it's a multi-ethnic country. Its diversity has been long neglected, and the particularities of indigenous and Afro-descendant population have been subsumed under the blending or mestizo discourse. Black population in Mexico has been traditionally ignored, although it has been estimated that around 2,000 African slaves were brought by the Spaniards. The first measurement ever of Afro-Mexican population took place 2 years ago with the 2015 Intersectional survey. Before, Afro-Mexicans were subsumed under the indigenous category. And even although the first measurement was done in 2015, subsequent surveys and administrative data continues neglecting all those important categories. So continuing with this question, where are the girls and adolescents? Until 2017, when the National Commission for the Development of Indigenous Peoples funded the first national report on violence against indigenous women and girls, they were almost inexistent. I had the privilege of coordinating this report that was handed over last May. And among many other phenomena, we examined feminicide in indigenous regions, as well as sterilization and intrauterine device insertion rates in indigenous municipalities. Let me tell you that in both cases, the rates are above the national average in most indigenous municipalities and regions. We also examine available data focusing on indigenous populations, and I will provide some of this data. Intersectional analysis in Mexico, normally, they tend to study the complexities of race, class, and gender within single social groups. I'm presenting this quantitative data from the best but limited national representative survey, as I mentioned, the National Survey on Household Dynamics. And I adopt an intersectional intragroup perspective to examine the intersection of multiple categories of oppression and stratification. In this slide, you can see how younger girls are at a higher risk of experiencing rape before the age of 15 years old. And this risk is much higher than the risk that they will have afterwards. Unfortunately, we don't have information about whether or not these girls, girls that they are 15 years old and younger, they were able to seek formal help. But we know about what's the help-seeking behavior of women that experienced rape or an attempted rape during the last 12 months. And what I can tell you is that people, like women that they speak an indigenous language, they tend to seek help less often than non-indigenous speaking language. By the way, let me tell you also that the definition that we have of indigenous peoples is based on language. So as you can imagine, it's a very restricted definition. Another way in which violence against indigenous women and girls is expressed is through child marriage and marriage against women's effective consent. 13% of the population, female population in Mexico, they were from 15 to 17 years old. They are already married or they are in a common union. Among indigenous women, 16% of the girls, 15 to 17 years old, they are already married or in a common law union. This survey shows us the reasons why women, indigenous women and non-indigenous women, they got married. And although the majority of the girls, they reported that they married because they wanted, we have a higher percentage of non-indigenous women that they report that a pregnancy triggered the union. Sometimes they get pregnant and they are being forced by their relatives to get married in order to save the family honor. However, among indigenous girls, there's a higher percentage that they report that they wanted to leave the house. The reasons why they wanted to leave the house need to be still examined, as well as other reasons. Continuing with these multiple ways in which violence can be manifested, another way is obstetric violence. Obstetric violence, it's defined as disrespectful and abusive treatment during childbirth that includes physical abuse, humiliations, verbal abuse, coerced and non-coerced medical procedures, including sterilization, lack of confidentiality, and refusal to provide pain medication, among others. Adolescents in Mexico, they are also experiencing obstetric violence, and this is a problem since teens, 17 years old and younger, gave birth to 8% of all the children born in Mexico during the last 5 years. Indigenous women, especially those 17 years old and younger, are at a higher risk of having experienced obstetric violence during their last childbirth than older indigenous women. It's like violence and abuse, but overall, in non-indigenous women, they reported to have experienced more obstetric violence. And I said they report because we have extensive qualitative research showing that obstetric violence is very prevalent among indigenous women. We conducted several focal groups with indigenous women, both in their communities and also in other types of settings. And for instance, the testimony of this woman is really shocking. She said, if you are wearing huaraches, I mean sandals, if you are dirty, or you are wearing your regional dress, it's a barrier for receiving health care. You smell as a program beneficiary, hueles a beneficiario. Women change their clothes to be on notice. They, the health care personnel, do not see us. Your identity and regional dress carries deep rejection and exclusion. Can you imagine the cases of adolescents that in addition of being indigenous, they are having babies because they have contravened social norms of being pure, I mean being virgin, until marriage? We also have empirical evidence from administrative data from the health department that in most municipalities, the rates of sterilization and insertion of intrauterine devices are much higher than the national average rates. I mean, the rates of sterilization and insertion of intrauterine devices in indigenous regions, they are higher than in non-indigenous regions. One would expect, if there's no bias, that the rates would be similar across regions after controlling by the population structure. But as you can see in this map, it's not like that. There are some indigenous regions where these two contraception methods are used at a very large scale. Administrative records, they don't allow us to assess whether or not they were consented or not. Administrative records, they don't gather information about whether or not the woman was indigenous or not. But at least it raises to me a lot of questions. So that makes me talk about this paradox about survey data showing that there's lower rates of violence among indigenous women and girls. This is the case of obstetric violence, as I mentioned before, but it's also the case of sexual harassment. It's also the case of street harassment. What we did, it was, I had the hypothesis that those were false negatives and that survey instruments, they are not culturally appropriate, nor they are designed from an intersectional perspective. What we found in those focus groups with indigenous women is that there's a lot of translation problems. Why? Because there's still a lot of women that they are monolingual, and in Mexico, more than 120 indigenous languages they are spoken. A woman was telling me, in our case, there's not a specific word for sexual. Whenever I was asking her about rape, she said, one would say, has anyone used you? ¿Alguien te ha usado? Because there's not a specific word. Also, there's a lot of stigma associated with being indigenous, and that makes women to say that they are fluent in Spanish when they are not. This woman was telling me, if I don't understand the question, because there are many things that I don't understand, I say that it didn't happen. I don't want people to think that I'm una india ignorante, that I'm an ignorant Indian. And also, we found a lot of concerns about confidentiality and the use of information. And that makes that a lot of people is reluctant to speak with interviewers. One would think, well, but we still have administrative data that can make us, can help us to assess what's the magnitude and what's the risk that indigenous girls and women are facing. Well, first of all, this kind of data, it's really limited because it's a self-selected sample. It's people that, after experiencing some kind of violence, they went to some public institution, which it does not mean that they recorded that they went there. According to the 2007 General Law on the Access of Women to a Life Free of Violence, there are different institutions at the federal, state, and municipal level responsible for preventing, assisting, and sanctioning acts of violence against women. As part of this national report that I was mentioning before, one of my colleagues sent almost 400 public information requests at the state and federal public agencies responsible for helping girls and women victims of violence. Only 27% of those institutions record data on whether the woman is indigenous or not. And I'm saying woman because of these 27%, only 20% records data on whether this woman is a girl or it's not. One would think that there would be like some kind of correlation between the amount of population in a certain state that speaks an indigenous language and that kind of practices. And what we find is that there's not such relationship. For instance, in the state of Oaxaca, where almost 1/3 of the population speaks an indigenous language, only 2 institutions providing services to women ask and collect information about whether the woman is indigenous or not. Okay, no, wait. one final thing, and sorry. One last thing that I would like to mention is that according to the 2007 General Law for Granting Women a Life Free of Violence, it's specified this mechanism called Gender Violence Alert, that it's an emergency and governmental action to confront and eradicate femicidal violence in a given area or region. There has been many requests from NGOs asking gender violence alerts to be issued. Let me tell you that only in 6 states there's a specific reference to indigenous women and girls, and only in 2 states, the state of Chiapas and the state of Campeche, the gender violence alert was issued for indigenous women. And that, in my opinion, is the result of this invisibilization cycle. Women, they don't tend to not seek help. We don't have enough information from surveys, not from administrative records. Without data, there's not a problem. If there's not a problem, then it's not addressed in public policy. Then violence continues. So my final remark is that we have limited information about gender violence in the intersection of age and ethnicity, and we need to adopt an intersectional perspective when designing collection data instruments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Our third presenter is Dr. Richard Miskolci, Associate Professor of Sociology at the Federal University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and a member of the graduate program in Sociology at the Federal University of San Carlos. Miskolci is a researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technological Development and coordinator of Kerere's research group on differences, human rights, and health. His work deals with gender and sexuality in a queer perspective, and his most recent research maps the conservative alliance against the advance on sexual and reproductive rights in Latin America. He has edited with Pedro Paulo Gomez Pereira a debate on this subject that is available online in English and Portuguese. And the debate's title is Who's Afraid of Judith Butler? The Moral Crusade on Human Rights in Brazil. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Evie and Rosemary, for inviting me for the plenary session. It's an honor to be here with you. And my talk will be about intersectional violence, but it will be more clear. It will be clear at the end, why I am talking about intersectional violence. The inspiration for this research is something connected to my adolescence, my teenage years, reading Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, when she speaks how to understand the resistance to feminism, the history of the resistance to feminism maybe is more interesting even in comparison to make a history of feminism itself, So what I try to do in my research is to understand the resistance to sexual and reproductive rights, and who are the ones that are resisting and trying to avoid that these rights could be available to everyone. So in the decade of 2010, reactions emerged to advances in sexual and reproductive rights in several Latin American countries, mainly after the approval of civil unions or marriage between people of the same sex in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. In the case of the last 3 countries, the legal recognition of homosexual unions was made by the highest courts, and the mobilization against them target educational materials created from a gender perspective that opposed sexual discrimination. In this brief presentation, I will synthesize a broad and complex situation, raising only the common elements in the Latin American context, while recognizing the importance of identifying local specificities and avoiding a rushed diagnosis of the existence of an organized international movement. Until now, the evidence points to the existence of a trading and exchange between groups in different national contexts without an actual global orchestration that could characterize an unified anti-gender movement. Among the common characteristics to these reactions to the advance of sexual and reproductive rights is the use of a vocabulary that labels them as gender ideology, a term originally created in the late 90s by Catholic and secular activists to oppose reforms that involved equality between men and women, same-sex marriage, access to new reproductive technologies, contraception and interruption of pregnancy, sexual education, and the criminalization of homophobia. The origin of the term gender ideology has been documented by scholars in different countries. Lay intellectuals have contributed to disseminating this ghost. Therefore, the so-called gender ideology is no longer a mere creation of the Vatican, but also of new Pentecostal evangelicals, as well as lay political actors. The term ideology is used to associate the demand for recognition of sexual diversity with the threat of a return of communism, which creates greater anxiety in former socialist countries of Europe and in Latin America among social sectors opposed to leftist governments and to the regimes of Cuba or Venezuela. In general, these social segments tend to associate the left, communism, and liberal ideas in the sphere of sexuality and gender to define supposed enemies who would threaten the moral construction of their nations. Evidence from various countries of the region allow raising the hypothesis that there is a growing separation of the agenda against gender ideology from its Catholic or even religious origins, as I will show by addressing the Brazilian case. Politicians and interest groups in the form of opportunistic moral entrepreneurs have come to adopt it as an electoral strategy to win followers by converting the grammar of the political dispute to the moral conflict between good citizens and others, often identified as feminists, homosexuals, and trans people. This tactic is usually adopted by politicians, parties, and organizations with a new liberal economic perspective who are conservative in moral terms and close to a right-wing populism in the public arena. The alliance between Catholic activists, those in Brazil known as New Pentecostal evangelicals, and civil society organizations with a right-wing profile frequently takes on characteristics of a moral crusade. The creation of a panic of a threat to children has been a common expedient in various countries for fighting educational materials or reforms that include content about gender and anti-homophobia. This occurred in Brazil in 2011 and later in 2014 and 15 during debate in Congress over National Education Plan and related state and municipal measures. In 2016, something similar took place in Colombia and Peru, reaching Paraguay in 2017, and more recently also in Costa Rica. In Brazil, this led to persecution of teachers, artists, and intellectuals. The most recent and emblematic case was the reaction to a visit by Judith Butler in November 2017, who was seen by these groups as the mother of gender ideology. That's the reason we have published Who's Afraid of Judith Butler. The campaign, in the shape of a moral crusade, sparked alliance among heterogeneous social sectors, interest in attracting followers on social networks, and in mobilizing people to attend public demonstrations. In legislative arenas, the aim was to stop the approval of laws, plans, or programs that could include a perspective supportive of sexual and reproductive rights. In 2016, it was perceived that they joined to take advantage of opportunities to disseminate their ideology by tying it in Brazil to a campaign against corruption and for the impeachment of leftist first female Brazilian president Dilma Rousseff, and in Colombia to the drafting of a peace agreement with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Anchored in the capillarity of the Catholic Church and Pentecostal evangelical church, but also in the way that their secular arms act in networks, act online, they succeeded, with support at times from the mainstream media, in presenting themselves to public opinion as having expressive popular support, even if only isolated studies have come to measure their actual social base. As observed in European contexts, in several Latin American countries, there are civil society organizations that function as empty shells. That is, they are led by a small group of people with economic and symbolic capital that allows creating a public image that they are a social movement with many supporters. But we are not sure if that's really what is happening. You know? The relative success of the campaign against sexual and reproductive rights can be explained because it is based on an alliance that unites at least 3 actors, each with its own but convergent objectives. The first is the Catholic Church, with its moral recognition and historical capillarity in Latin America, seeking to shape the human rights agenda according to its interests. The second are the evangelicals, especially the neo-Pentecostalists, who are striving to conquer greater moral and political protagonism in countries like Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Venezuela. The third are right-wing interest groups and politicians who make strategic use of the moral agenda to create or broaden their base of popular support. Thus, the alliance has proven to be beneficial to both its religious and secular components. Thus, the religious and political actors have become allies in efforts to bar the expansion of rights and greater equality of gender that they consider to contradict their principles and their action. The alliance benefits the secular interest groups and politicians who represent them by helping them gain adeptus to their neoliberal agenda. The moral platform has been defended within a repertoire of action that involves the creation of a moral panic to disseminate fear as a strategy of mobilization to stop legal and cultural change, creating a polarization between feminist and LGBT movements and religious actors and their supporters. Their discursive trope involves hyperbolic language that presents sexual and reproductive rights as a potential catastrophe for collective life. In their public manifestations, they defend the natural family and children as if they were threatened by a homosexual conspiracy. In some countries, it is possible to recognize in these manifestations the coordination of conservative local organizations and international movements, both religious and secular ones. If in some national contexts, such as Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, religious activists have been able to mobilize large street demonstrations in support of the family, in others, like Brazil, their action has mainly focused on smaller protests aimed at legislative chambers in legal persecution of teachers, who they believe are indoctrinating students, and artists whose work or performance they believe threaten childhood. The creation of a panic to trigger a campaign in the form of a moral crusade tends to make invisible the secular groups that are part of the circumstantial alliance against sexual and reproductive rights, evoking equivocal diagnosis that its origin can be reduced to a religious fundamentalism. Paternotte and Coer emphasized the fact that we are witnessing the emergence of a new generation of activists with traditional values, questioning, therefore, their classification as conservative because they effectively act to construct a future society. Thus, the evidence collected by researchers in Europe and also in Latin America indicate that we are facing a movement that cannot be accurately classified as religious fundamentalist or conservative. The doubt about what is regressive, conservative, or a new activism, which I provisorily call here as traditionalist, tends to take place more among analysts who presuppose an inexorable historical route towards the conquest of rights and recognition. It is important to be careful to recognize that nothing guarantees that we are heading in this direction. Many researchers portray the dispute about human rights in international forums by showing that in reality nothing is guaranteed, you know. What is happening is that it still exists, you know, difference in adversaries to sexual and reproductive rights. Considering the Brazilian case, sociologist Berenice Bento affirms that we are witnessing the beginning of an intensification of disputes in this field, in which traditionalist segments have expressed themselves since the 60s. The Catholic Church, for example, remains a powerful actor that recognized the change in its battlefield from Europe to Latin America, which helps understand the political significance of the abdication of Benedict XVI, followed by the election of Francis. The first visit made by the Latin American Pope was to Rio de Janeiro to attend World Youth Day. In one of his talks, the Supreme Pontiff called on Catholic youth to be revolutionaries, strengthening a new generation that we now know can struggle with the Vatican against the concept of gender in favor not of equality between men and women, but of their complementarity, and of the family understood in naturalized terms, and sexuality as inseparable from reproduction. Young Catholics, new Pentecostal evangelicals, and secularists linked to right-wing groups and politicians that adhere to this moral agenda form a new generation of activists that we have barely begun to know. Their action to keep abortion criminalized, as well as the refusal to fight violence against LGBT people, create the worst consequence for the most poor, non-white, and youngest portions of the population. Studies indicate that the inexistence of sexual education, access to contraceptives, and official service to interrupt pregnancy expose poor Black, mestizo, or indigenous women to greater risk of death, and that the non-recognition of sexual diversity relegates homosexuals, trans, and transvestite people to constant physical, legal, and legal insecurity, suffering continuous forms of discrimination, harassment, and violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We'll move without delay to the last presenter, Dr. Grace Khunou, who comes to us from South Africa. She was awarded her PhD from WITS in 2007, resulting from a PhD fellowship from the WITS Institute for Social and Economic Research. She is currently a professor in the Sociology Department of the University of Johannesburg. She was the president of the South African Sociological Association in 2015-2016, and the Vice Dean Research in the Humanities at the University of Johannesburg in 2015-2016. Professor Khunou has also served in the Council of the South African Sociological Association and was part of the editorial collective for the South African Sociological Review between 2012 and 2014. Her research is in understanding the Black condition through a focus on gender, health, social policy, class, Black middle class, and social institutions. She writes creatively and academically and has published over 20 peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, and research reports. These include her edited book, The Emergent Middle Class, in 2015, and a special issue on father absence in the Open Family Studies Journal in 2015. Please join me in welcoming Professor Grace Khunou.
Sanbonani, good afternoon. I'm going to read my paper. I don't have slides. The title of my paper is The Violence of Erasure and the Significance of Excavating the Histories of the Oppressed. The Fallist movement in South Africa was led by students in 2015. It was the first movement of its kind, as it showed the intersections of oppression and used decoloniality as a theoretical framework. This movement called for the removal of the Rhodes statue from the University of Cape Town. It also called for university fees to fall and for a shift away from contracting of support staff. Although this movement was university-based and primarily focused on student-related issues, the movement shook South African society as a whole, as it also called for decolonization of society. The Fallist movement made visible the continuing and intersecting inequalities in broader society, including in the workplace, in university curricula, and most importantly for this paper, this movement revealed the problematics in gender politics in South Africa. At a very important moment during the Fallist movement, there was a rupture in the unity among its leaders. This rupture led to a new hashtag, which was Patriarchy Must Fall. The young women leaders in the movement refused to be erased from the narrative of that moment and the making of her story that the moment called for. The actions by the young women leaders revealed the pervasive positivist attitudes of hypermasculine privilege within society and made visible how women's contribution to development gets erased. The Patriarchy Must Fall movement was argued by other, especially male Fallist leaders, to be detrimental to the main movement against increasing university fees. This illustrated how women's issues have been historically marginalized. Past struggles against apartheid became single-issue politics, with women's issues being argued to be of less significance. Single-issue movements are violent as they tend to erase and marginalize the experiences and contributions of the already oppressed. Mampela Rampela, in her analysis of the movements against apartheid, clearly shows that the experiences of Black women with patriarchy during apartheid were sidelined and argued to be detrimental to the fight against racism and apartheid. Although that seemed like a good strategy at the time, it buried the experiences of women and delayed their emancipation. Thus, the call for patriarchy to fall during the Fallist movement in 2015-2016 in South Africa was a call emanating from an unresolved past. What this call did for me was to awaken the truth about the invisible place of ordinary Black women in the South African history. Since 1994, we've had a number of firsts. The first professor in the humanities at Wits was Phumla Gola, and she was inaugurated in 2016. Phumla is not the only one. There's a number of these firsts in all sectors of South African society. My discomfort with the many Black women firsts since 1994 is the underlying unspoken assumption that it is difficult to find capable Black women, that the few who are making a contribution are exceptional. This, I will argue, is a result of the violence of erasure. The spaces in society where ordinary Black women have contributed are marginalized. This discomfort informed my entry into these questions of erasure and their violence. I ask, where were the Black women before 1994? What was their contributions? Why do we not know about them? What are the effects of this lack of information on the consciousness of young women today? What have been the mechanisms for their erasure from history? And what are the reasons for their erasure? These are the questions I'm grappling with. In this paper, I will share some of my thoughts on them. The erasure of the contribution of women, and especially Black women, from South African history is glaring. What is clear from literature, though, is that the general erasure of women is a global phenomenon. Shrivastava writes about how it manifests in Indian society and argues that this erasure continues even after the development of disciplines like the history of women. The idea of placing women in history has been engaged by women writers and feminists as early as the 1950s. In 1970, Lena and many others write from many disciplines, including psychology and sociology, among others. And they argue for the significance of women and the restoration of women as historical players. Out of this call and attempts to restore women back into history, there remains an important gap. Shrivastava shows that what remains less invincible is the history of ordinary women of color. This erasure is not only real with regards to women's role in everyday life, it is also true in societal institutions like universities. In the book, Excavating Women, A History of Women in European Archaeology, Diaz, Adrie, and Stix Sorensen argue that the discipline of archaeology has been very good at selecting and forgetting, and thus marginalizing women's contribution. This is not only true in the discipline of archaeology, but in the academic project in general. Women's contribution to the making of the disciplines has been relegated to the margins. Hill Collins writes about the marginal position of Black women in the academy and how being in touch with this marginality produces distinctive standpoints. Mabukela and Magubane in the South African context writes about how this marginality manifests in the South African academy by focusing on how racism and sexism tries to mute Black women academics. In the introduction of her essay, Placing African Women's History and Locating Gender, Hunter asserts that African women, whether as subjects or objects, and to a lesser extent as authors of history, are no longer invincible in African historiography. Despite continuing lapses in awareness, invisibility is no longer the problem. Close quote. She then goes on to point out that a few historical anthologies, monographs, and dissertations have been written on African women, thus making a case for the argument that African women are no longer invincible. I make a case in this paper that visibility is a complex phenomenon. For Black women in South Africa, the question of visibility is not just about being seen, it is about how the historical lens portrays these women, and it's also about what is omitted in the process of making their contribution visible. Again, in South African society, it is also important when we talk about visibility to also ask which women's contributions remain marginalized and how all these contribute to the lapse in awareness of women's historical contribution. Although there has been attempts to acknowledge women's contribution to societal development, these have been inconsistent. And have focused on a few exceptional women, suggesting that only a few women are capable, thus denying the fact that all women are able. The problem with centering so-called exceptional women, Lena writes, illustrates the limited analytical lens of traditional history, which fails to tell us much about activities in which most women engage, and also in telling us about the significance of women activities to society as a whole. An important limitation of traditional history is that it overlooked how race and class impacted which roles and which women's activities were deemed of historical importance. The erasure of Black women from history is also visible in how we phrase the question of what their contributions has been. Lena argues that conceptualizing women's contribution history is problematic when it is judged by standards appropriated from masculinities. When thinking about Black women, we therefore need to be cognizant of their position and thus center the contribution that position called for. I'm gonna skip parts of the paper. Okay, so the broader project that informed this paper is based on a reading is based on a reading and excavation of the narratives of multiple groups of women in South Africa. These women include Winnie Mandela, Charlotte Maxeke, Miriam Tladi, Mam Sobukwe, Albertina Sisulu, women in trade unions, black women domestic workers, women of Marikana, and stories of many other black women whose names I do not know. In my reading of these narratives, I attempt to illustrate how violence was used to erase the contribution of these women as significant historical figures in South African society, and how in turn the erasure of their contribution is a violation of the rights of those who remain. It's a violation of the rights of those who could have drawn from their stories for inspiration. After the passing of Winnie Mandela in April this year, the apartheid state's method of divide and rule used to break black South Africa was revealed in ways that had not been visible, before. For days after Winnie's passing, we watched with multiple emotions as footage and texts that had not been publicly shared before were shared on social media and on national TV. After the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, doubt was cast on the person of Winnie Mandela. The commission pushed the argument that Winnie was undoubtedly involved in the killing of Stompie Mwekezi. Thus, she was found to be politically and morally unaccountable for the gross violations of human rights committed by the Mandela United Football Club. This cemented for many why she was undeserving of the title of First Lady for South Africa, and it justified why Mandela sought a divorce from her after his release from prison. This was part of an attempt to erase her from history. One of the documentaries shown after her passing revealed that the apartheid state, through its operative, Vic McPherson, who worked for Stratcom, a government body dedicated to spreading propaganda and misinformation against anti-apartheid activists, shared how he used multiple methods to discredit Winnie. These methods included infiltrating the Mandela Football Club with spies. The Mandela Football Club had been created to protect Winnie. McPherson attempted to discredit Winnie by also writing letters to newspapers to suggest that she had extramarital affairs, and by planting other information to fuel her downfall from the leadership echelons of the ANC. To a large extent, these attempts succeeded in erasing the many heroic faces that represent Winnie. In her book, 49 Days, Prisoner Number 132369, Winnie shares the horrific experiences of her detention, the violation she experienced during this 491 days would have driven many people into madness. However, Winnie shares in these prison diaries how the multiple attempts of the apartheid police to break her actually built her resolve to fight back. For many South Africans, it was easy to doubt her and thus to forget that she was the first social worker, thus shining the beacon on possibilities of access to education for rural black girls. She was afraid when she came to the city for the first time, but she came anyway and confronted both racist powers of apartheid and patriarchy. They forget that she stood up to the police on a daily basis in her attempt to protect young people and women. She was married. They forget that she was married, yet she remained single. They forget that she raised her children in a violent space without her husband. They forget that she was constantly harassed by the apartheid police, but that this did not stop her from standing up for the marginalized. She was under house arrest for many months, removed from the Soweto she loved, yet she found a way to build a community and serve the people of Bradford. In conclusion, I argue that it is important to excavate the stories of the oppressed so as to restore them as important historical players. This excavation should be in multiple forms. Shrivastava argues that it should include discovering and preserving women's records, and most importantly, it should involve the broadening of the conceptual and narrative frameworks of mainstreaming historical traditions. Thank you.
I'm fine. Thank you very much, Grace, and a big thank you to all our presenters. We are left with about 4, perhaps at most 5 minutes for questions. So we will take perhaps 1 or 2 questions and have our presenters respond wherever they like. So open to questions, comments. Please keep them very brief and concise.
Hi. Is it working? Yeah. The 4 presentations were wonderful, and I want to congratulate, but I want to make 1 comment on Michael's paper and 1 question to Pat. You mentioned that the movements that you're talking about are traditionalist, and I really want to protest against that, because all these so-called populist and autochthonic political movements which use religious and nationalist discourses are actually trying to create revolution and use a lot of violence, gender and not. We heard yesterday from Evie about the Yazidi girls. In the Cairo UN conference, the Vatican and Iran were completely allies in relation to gender. I think we have to differentiate between the goals of a political movement and the discourse that they use. In terms of Pat, as always, I'm very inspired by what you said, but I want to get some clarification. What, according to you, is the relationship between violence and power? Are they 2 distinct things? Is violence a particular kind of power, a particular technology of power, or are they the same? I would be grateful if you can clarify this. Thanks.
No, please you answer, because it was just a comment.
I don't know. And that's really the honest answer. And I think it's really unfair of you to ask me that question, because you know that's a tough question, all right? But I think that is at the heart of it all, to be honest with you. I really think, I've never thought of power as just being domination. And if it were just domination, then violence would be a technology of domination. And that would be the point of intersection. That would be the saturated site. We're just looking for that. But I've also thought of power as under the term of empowerment, of how one chooses these ideas and places them in service to something bigger. So the whole notion of looking to sites of violence as potentially identifying the places that are pressure points for empowerment. For example, if the violence is one of the erasure of the story of Winnie Mandela, empowerment in that context would be pushing back against that form of violence. And that would maybe perhaps broaden our concept, not just of violence or our concept of intersectionality, but our concept of power as well. So one implication of my presentation is that if you always take power into consideration throughout everything we work on, it can be a backstage theme, and I think that's what it was today, and I think that's, for me at least, and I think that's what it was in the presentation that I made today. But I think the goal is to get to a place of a more robust understanding of power that might be informed by intersectionality. I was very intrigued by your referring to I can never say this word, well, it's not colonization, it's decoloniality, I can't get it out, but Grace says it beautifully, as a theoretical framework that is very much being used by a younger generation, because that strikes me, and that's what I've Brazil as well. All right, and that's what stands out for me as a power framework, as something that's putting power much more central to analysis and with tremendous implications for intersectionality. So, so I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that's the question we should ask.
Should I?
Okay, I think we have come to the end of the time for this plenary. Thank you very much for your participation. A big thank you to the four great presenters.
Understand very well why she considers that these people should not be called traditionalists.